And welcome everyone to this week's Maternity and Midwifery Hour. This is season 18, session one. And I can't believe we're coming into now the 6th year of doing the Maternity and Midwifery Hour. My name's Sue MacDonald. I'm the curator for this hour and for the Maternity and Midwifery Festivals. And it's my pleasure to be, chairing today. I nearly said curating. I've already done the curation and now it's the chairing bit. So I'm joined this evening by Dr. Suzanne Crozier, who many of you will know. And as we always do to our guests, we always ask them to share a moment of the week. And I know she's got an interesting moment to share. Suzanne, welcome. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for that nice introduction. Thank you for asking me. Yeah, my moment of the week. I've started learning German. I did a bit at school, but I've started learning again because my son and his family live in Germany, and I feel very incapacitated when I turn up and open my mouth, and everybody around me can speak really good English. So, and the German class that I was at yesterday was just such a joy. It's a small group, lots of different people with different backgrounds, different levels of ability, and a teacher who was there and could take the time to plan different activities. And it just reminded me of how enjoyable learning can be, particularly in small groups and with other people. So that was my moment of the day, reflecting on the joys of learning, even if I'm still not very good at German.
I bet you're better than you think you are. That's fabulous, Suzanne. Thank you so much. And of course, I was reading something a little while ago that if you learn something new, you put it as much as possible in your week, it actually helps keep all the brain cells going. Not a surprise, really, but in this day of people talking about Alzheimer's and stress and everything, this sort of thing can really make a difference. And that's a lovely example, Suzanne. Thank you so much. Well, we'll let Suzanne have a little rest before we move on. And I'm just going to really welcome our new people because I know we've got quite a lot of new people joining us this evening, as well as our old friends. Not old in the old way, but you've been watching for a little while. And just to remind people where we started, because I think it's quite important personally. We started at the first lockdown for COVID-19 in March 2020. So we're coming into our 6th year now. And we really started this because midwives, student midwives, all the people working in the maternity services couldn't go to study days or conferences or festivals at that point because one, they were far too busy with all the clinical demands they had on them at the time, but also the rules were no sort of outings like a study day or a conference. So we started this really to support our midwives and our student midwives and give them as much information as possible, and also to act like a linkage between professionals, which has been really good. And we obviously in the early days talked a lot about COVID and talked a lot about the service changes in practice and education that were going on in response to COVID. And that for me was fascinating because what it showed was the creativity and the strength of midwives and student midwives, maternity care support workers, pediatricians, obstetricians, all of them working together. The teamwork was fabulous at that point. And I'd love to hold on to some of the things we really learned in COVID. I think we've lost a few of them, but I think we should recapture some that were really important to us. Now, the other thing I need to mention, just in case you have a power cut and a mouse eats through your internet cable or something dreadful like that, which has happened, um, everything is recorded. So if you have to leave halfway through this session, or actually what is more likely is you want to watch it all over again and share it with all your colleagues and friends, this is available through Netflix and through lots of other different platforms, and you can share, and we like you to share. And indeed, when Suzanne was talking about learning, for me, it's really important to be able to share and discuss what you're watching and what you're understanding and discuss it. Have a debate, a little argument, maybe. That's not a problem. So it's all accessible, and it's accessible because Matflix, our little friends, look after the whole back catalogue of all the festivals, all the maternity hours that we've done. So you can access lots of material from there. If your institution is signed up, it's all free. It's not very much to sign up for a monthly subscription. If you use it, beware, it's addictive because once you start looking at some of the presentations, you can find a couple of hours has gone by and you've learned some new things and it's been very useful for your revalidation or for project work or assignments that you might be doing. But it is a bit addictive. So that's my health warning for this evening. And I'm going to say, look after yourselves. I'll say this at the beginning and I'll say this at the end because I know there's a bit of flu and colds around and you need to look after yourselves for the work you're doing anyway. Now, in terms of news, it was lovely to see the New Year's honours because we had some midwives. Not enough midwives were there, but we had some. One of which was Anne Remmers, who had an OBE. You'll know Anne Remmers is very much into the leadership. She talked at the Bath festival a little while ago about some of the work she was doing with Maternity Matters, Black Maternity Matters, which is fantastic. Also, Sally Ashton May, who was appointed an MBE, Hilary Alba, who was also made an MBE for services to vulnerable women in Glasgow, and Sandra Igwe, who was made an MBE. You'll know her from her as CEO of the Motherhood Group, has done a huge amount for Black mums. And Alison Morton, OBE, who's the Chief Executive of the Institute of Health Visiting for services to health visiting, and Professor Maria McGill-Gorm, OBE, Chief Nursing Officer for Northern Ireland, also awarded for services to nursing and midwifery. So that was a nice thing to start the year with. I've just popped a few things as well as the fantastic resources you have from Suzanne. There's some little extra ones, which includes a new data brief on maternal mortality, which came out last week from the National Perinatal Epidemiology Unit. And there is a link on the resources. And it's quite a good read. It's quite short, but it's really useful and interesting if you're looking at anything in maternal mortality. And I think we need to all be very aware because mortality rates they picked up that are 20% higher than in 2009 to 2011. And it's not necessarily statistically significant, but we're always looking to lower the rates, not let them go up at all. And also, the usual thing is thrombosis and thromboembolism remain leading cause of death for up to the period up to 6 weeks after the birth of the baby. But suicide remains also a leading cause, and that it tends to be more strong through 6 weeks to a year of life of the baby. And there are still these very strong inequalities. And mainly this threefold difference in maternal mortality rates for Black women compared to white women, and Asian women's risk is also slightly higher compared to white women. In 2019 to 2021, this was lowered. So we've kind of gone a little bit backwards, and it would be useful to kind of explore why that is. So do have a look. It's got lots of information there. And the RCM have actually commented on this to point out the issue of workload stressors, which we all know about, and the lack of investment in the maternity service, which might well have impacted on these statistics. It might be useful for you to look or listen actually to Leah Hazard talking about working conditions and stresses on midwives, which was on Radio 4 Women's Hour today. And again, there's a link in the resources. And if you're not part of a BBC Listen Again, it's free. You just have to sign in and register. Oh, so and Leah's coming a little bit later in the series, I ought to add, and that will be really interesting because she's very passionate about this subject of midwives being bullied, midwives not working the hours they should be. Guess what? They're working more. No change really, but we need to address the issues and make sure midwives are supported. Anyway, now I've almost finished exactly perfectly on time to introduce our speaker. Now, we're going to be looking at what we can learn from the stories of newly qualified midwives, looking at research, exploring the experience of those newly qualified midwives and the implications for supporting and developing their skills and their kind of, well, the skills and their well-being, I guess. Suzanne will highlight these. So I'm really delighted to introduce Suzanne Crozier, Dr. Suzanne Crozier. She's recently retired. I don't think she will really retire properly, though. She was Associate Professor and Head of Teaching and Learning at Edinburgh Napier University, but she retains the visiting role at Napier. She's also undertaking consultancy work related to education quality assurance in England and Scotland, which she's had a lot of skills within this during her career, including a secondment with the Nursing and Midwifery Council. She's got a huge amount of experience and has also been lead midwife for education at the University of Northumbria and completed this work as her doctorate, exploring the concept of employability within midwifery. So welcome, Suzanne. Thank you so much for coming this evening. And the screen is now yours. I'm looking.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And thank you for that lovely introduction. It was really, sometimes it's nice to hear that all said back to you. So that was lovely. Thank you. So yeah, as Sue has introduced me, I'm going to be talking about becoming and being a midwife. And these slides are drawn from my doctorate study that I completed at Northumbria University. Interestingly, given Sue's reflection on where this started, I actually did the bulk of this work during COVID, so that was shaped a little bit by that as well. My first slide, my title slide there has got a picture of two knitted midwives on. That usually causes a little bit of people thinking, oh, knitted midwives, what's that about? So I put them on so I can tell you a little bit about me. Sue's given you a little bit of background to my academic career. I've been a midwife since I qualified as a midwife in 1986, I think it was. My daughter is a midwife as well. In fact, I knitted one of those midwives and my daughter crocheted the other. And we did it for the RCM conference in Harrogate a few years ago when there was a campaign to knit more midwives. There you are, Sue's got one as well. Sue knitted one. And really just to emphasize that I have had a long career in midwifery, and most of that in education and a lot of that in quality assurance. And quality assurance, thinking about what do we need to do to prepare students to become the midwives that we need them to be, that the women that we've just heard Sue describe, particularly those vulnerable groups, how do we prepare midwives to undertake that role? And over that time, I've seen the education of midwives change a lot. From when Sue and I were students, we were employees, to now we have, students on undergraduate and postgraduate courses, and also the standards that they are expected to achieve. Sue showed me, I'm going to ask you now, Sue, she showed me the book that she had, that this is what she had to fill in. I'm sure all the students, when you see this, you're all going to start, there's going to be a bit of a bit of consternation. If you think about your e-pad, this was Sue's equivalent. Have you got it there, Sue? That little book, that's what she had to fill in for her when she was a student midwife.
Angela, that's it. It's a little thin book, and I covered it nicely, look, like a schoolgirl. And this is, yeah, simple. Simples.
Simple. So I've seen that change a lot, and during that time as well, we've also had discussions, narratives around generational differences, and that maybe the younger, newer generation are somehow different. And obviously, increasingly, there's been concern about the workforce and retaining newly qualified midwives in the workforce. So all of this was sort of informed me and my thinking and where I am. So tonight I'm going to talk about a bit about employability, because that's really the lens that I was looking at everything through, a bit about identity and what it means to be a midwife. And in fact, that a lot about identity, because that's what my study was about. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the study findings. I have talked about this before at a couple of other conferences. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but then I'm going to talk a bit about communities and landscapes of practice and how that might help us think about how we can better prepare and support students and newly qualified midwives, and what it means to be a midwife, how midwives develop their identity, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Hopefully, if I don't go down a little rabbit hole, I'll try not to. So let's start off with the employability debate then. So there are lots of definitions of employability. You can get yourself down a little rabbit hole if you were to do a literature search or a Google search about that. On the reference list, there is a literature search that was done a few years ago that if you're interested, you might want to read it about. And employability is really important to the government. It's important to higher education broadly. And obviously, it's also important to the regulators, to the Nursing and Midwifery Council, the Health and Care Professionals Council, the General Medical Council, because they want their professionals to exit their education programmes being employable, and suitable for the work that they've been prepared for. And when I was lead midwife for education at Northumbria University, I was never really tasked to think too much about employability, because nurses and midwives all got jobs at that point in time. I know that's not the case now, but 4 or 5 years ago, well, probably more than that, 5 to 10 years ago, everybody got a job. So the employment figures were really good. And so nobody said, oh, you need to do more about employability for your program. Whereas my colleagues in sociology and psychology were having to write plans about employability and how they're going to make sure their students get jobs. And you think as well, I used to think anyway, well, these are vocational courses. If these aren't preparing students for the workplace, then what on earth, what are we doing? And then I had an aha moment, because I was sat at a university meeting and we'd introduced a career readiness survey. Some of you who are students or who've been students recently, and those of you who are in education will maybe be familiar with it. It's a very short, simple survey. And I thought, well, I don't know why we're asking this of our student nurses and midwives. Clearly they're career ready, because we've put them through this very explicit course with these huge books of everything they've got to do, and half their course is on placement in the area where they're going to be seeking work. And actually the career readiness data was a little bit better for the student nurses and midwives, but not that much better. And I just thought, this is really interesting. There's something going on here. So that really made me think a bit more about what is meant by employability and what that might mean for programs such as nursing and midwifery. So I actually at that point had been given a role to review employability right across the university. So I was really reading a lot and thinking a lot about it. And employability often is described as sort of soft skills, things like teamwork, communication, critical thinking and problem solving skills. It's often described as graduate attributes, but increasingly the literature talks about identity and self-esteem, and this idea that somebody needs to feel that they are something, that they can be whatever the job is that they need to be in order for their employment to stick and for them to be employable, if that makes sense. And that led me to the work of Holmes, who identified employability in 3 particular ways. He talked about employability is often defined as a set of skills, so things that you can do. And obviously for midwifery, we've got a big set of skills that everybody has to be able to do. And in fact, if you do a literature search, unsurprisingly, for midwifery employability, you get a lot around skill and competence and proficiency. That is the way in which it's the narrative around employability in midwifery is around skill and attributes. But Holmes said it's also important to consider social position and how people fit into the social structures where they're sent to work or where they're on placement. That's equally important. But even more important, he argues, is around how they then develop an identity. The process of identity development is ultimately what he feels represents employability. So I thought, well, this is all really interesting, and it does reflect it's not about nursing or midwifery or any health program. It actually comes from business. But I thought that gives a different lens to look at employability. And so I'm going to have a bit more of a think about this. So when I did the literature review, there is, as I said, there's a great deal written about proficiencies and skills and attributes that midwives need and things that they do and don't have, which again, sometimes you read all of this and you think, could we be a bit more positive about, our future generations and the things that they are bringing? Because often you would find articles where the research suggests that there is a skill deficit that seems to come across, and that's well, I'll explain a bit further about why I maybe don't think that's so positive as we move through. But there's very little written about midwifery identity as such. A general definition of identity that I've got there is about, describing how an individual, who they think they are and how they construct and make sense of themselves. Their identities are constituted, can't speak German, can't speak English, from the cultural and political discourse that surrounds them. And that's really important when we think about the cultural and political discourse that surrounds student and newly qualified midwives and experienced midwives who've been around a long time. Midwives, I don't know if there's maybe many, hopefully there's lots of other experienced midwives. I sometimes look back on my career and I do think, oh, crikey, look at everything that isn't how it should be. And I've been doing this all this time. And is there anything different I could have done to and it impacts everybody, doesn't it? Right through from the student who's applying to the people right at the end of their career. That discourse impacts on your professional identity. But we know as well that professional identity, having a strong professional identity, is linked to good self-esteem and confidence and can be linked to positive outcomes as well. So that's what we know about midwifery identity. So what did I do? Well, I did a narrative inquiry, and I chose narrative inquiry because narrative inquiry is about storytelling and listening to stories. And stories are very much about identity. I'm telling you all a story now, and in that I'm creating an image of who I am, starting with a knitted midwife, I guess, and that lovely introduction that Sue gave me. And you're listening to that story and creating your own version of that as you listen. So it very much fits into notions of identity. And also storytelling is very much a part of how midwives learn and how they learn from each other, listening to the stories that are told. So I thought it fitted really well. I asked participants to share stories with me about how they became a midwife. So I did interviews during the COVID pandemic. They were all online. I had 5 midwives, so it's quite a small sample, but in narrative inquiry, that's not so much of an issue. We're not trying to prove or demonstrate anything. We're purely looking to create stories to generate ideas and discussion and contribute in some way to midwifery knowledge. And I analysed those stories, and I identified 5 stages, 5 temporal stages that seemed to be common across. And in fact, they were very similar, when using the stories as an analogy, very similar to the hero's journey or the quest journey that some of you might be familiar with. If you think about films like Star Wars, for example, this idea that there's a hero who has a challenge to face and various obstacles on the way, and then they get there and they've achieved what they set out to achieve. And I analysed and restoried those stories to preserve the voice of the participants. So I don't have any quotes to share with you because that's not how narrative inquiry works. But I re all of the participants' voices all embedded in the context of their story, and to lift it out maybe doesn't help it to make sense. So I don't have any quotes to share, but I did identify some plot elements which I can talk a little bit. So things that occurred commonly across the different stories. So the 5 stages of the journey were starting out, the student journey, choosing where to work, working as a midwife, and being a midwife. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the 3 stages in bold. I'll just give a brief summary of the other 2, though, so that you don't feel that I've suggested something and then left it hanging in the air. When I asked people to tell me about how they became a midwife, they started off really often a long time before they actually thought about applying to becoming a midwife. They started talking about their identity as a woman, the way they identified with other women and wanting to help women and make things better for women. So the values and that identity was really strong even before they got to their UCAS form or thinking about what they might say at an interview. And that was all of the people that I interviewed. And I think it'd be really interesting to, widen the sample group. It was a very homogenous group. They were all white women from the northeast of England. It would be interesting to find a wider group and see if that was the same story there. And the choosing where to work was also interesting. I wasn't expecting that, but 4 of the 5 participants spent a long time telling me about how they decided about where they were going to work. Now, I know currently not students maybe don't feel they have a choice. They just feel lucky if they can get a job. That wasn't the case 5 years ago when I did these interviews, and students could choose. They often had multiple offers of jobs, and that gave them another set of decisions to make around their career. But it also allowed them, interestingly for me, to talk about how their identity either matched or didn't match with where they were choosing to go and work. So that was interesting as well. So let's, I've gone the wrong way. Sorry, let's go the right way. Going backwards in my journey. So the student journey. So the 3 plot elements I wanted to maybe think about tonight were being prepared, fitting in, and companions. So thinking about maybe those graduate attributes and graduate skills, it was evident that the only skill that was described to me in any detail by the participants was the skill of time management and organisation. Nobody said, oh, it was really difficult learning how to do an abdominal palpation, or I never managed how to run an IV line through. Those skills weren't mentioned, but things like staying on top of the work, being organised, they were really important. And the one person who was already a graduate of a science subject found that a lot easier because she was able to, I guess, bring her transferable skills from being a graduate in a previous employment into being a midwife. And I guess that just makes me think, what can we do as educators, as midwifery supervisors and assessors, professional midwifery advocates, midwifery managers and leaders, universities, are we helping students to be organised by giving them the information that they need and the deadlines that they need and the reasonable assessment schedules and all of those things? Because that really was a fundamental part of that experience of being a student. So was your ability to fit in. I don't think that's a surprise. There's a lot of literature around that. But the students talked about the very positive experience, mostly positive experiences they had with mentors. They were mentors at this point in time. We hadn't implemented SSSA when these midwives were students. But I think the word mentor is interesting because when you look at story analogies, one of the characters in that classic story, going back to Star Wars again, is this idea of a mentor or somebody to help steer you through your journey. So I think in a way it's quite nice that I was still able to use the word mentor in my thesis. But also students talked about when they were students, and remember these are qualified midwives when I'm talking to them, so they're reflecting back, they're constructing their story for me, and they talked about maybe keep it being anonymous if you could be, and not drawing any attention to yourself. Maybe better if people didn't actually know who you were. And so that was interesting as well. And maybe at the end, if there's some students involved, we might get some questions around that. It wasn't the universal experience, but there was that did come across. And finally, and importantly, companions, the friendships that are made while students or students carry on into their early employment experience and offer a really good level of support, and the good mentors and other midwives and professionals who help the students as well were also really important in that student journey. Working as a midwife, there's been a lot written about newly qualified midwives. There is a lot of literature and research around there about that transition from student to newly qualified midwife and the challenges. And in fact, a lot of that focuses on the social aspects and the challenge of fitting into the culture. So I didn't necessarily want to replicate all of that. But what I saw in the stories that I was creating from the data that I had from the midwives was that there was it was important that there was a welcome of some sort, that initiation for the people who chose to stay where they had been students. That came across really strongly. People were like, oh, you know, you've got your uniform on now, that's great, you're one of us. And that really positive welcoming part was really important. Very much that you don't really learn how to be a midwife until you're being a midwife. And that's will lead me on in a couple of slides to communities of practice, that actually it doesn't matter. I don't, after all my year, I think we need to educate midwives, absolutely. And I wouldn't like to go back to a training model, because I think education is so important, because education develops understanding and awareness beyond the task that you're having to do. And I think that's really important. But I know that where students really learn is when they're in practice, and they really learn how to be a midwife once they're qualified. So that working and learning. Now, you probably spotted the word ordeal. And when I've spoken about this at conferences before, I've made a bit more of a discussion around this. But what I will say, it wasn't something I was expecting, but what in the stories that I was told, and remember I asked them, how have you become a midwife? How have you got to where you are now? They all had a key thing that had happened. Now, 3 or 4 of them were quite, you know, they were obstetric emergencies or near misses or other, you know, difficult, challenging situations. And I have to be aware, as somebody who knew them previously as students, maybe they volunteered to be interviewed because they wanted to tell me about it. And that might be why it featured in the story. You know, maybe newly qualified midwives need to have somebody to talk to about these things that have happened. And bear in mind, this was during COVID as well. So some of the support that we would hope would be there maybe was missing, because, as Sue said earlier, you know, services were distracted in other ways. But nonetheless, I did feel, and when I thought about that story analogy, that really what they were saying was, in order to become a midwife, you had to face this challenge. You had to find out how you were going to cope with that thing that you always hope isn't going to happen, but is going to happen, and you're going to have to deal with it. And what was evident in the stories, again, a small sample, and I'm not suggesting there's causation here at all, but in the positive stories, the other midwives and in particular the midwifery manager had a very key role in steering the newly qualified midwives through that situation so that they were out the other end. And I said I wasn't going to give you any quotes, but I'm going to now, because I think it's a really nice one. One of the newly qualified midwives actually said that she feels now she can make an informed choice about being a midwife because she really understands what it's about. So that's why I put the ordeal in there, not because it's an awful thing and to for the students listening thinking, I mean, you probably already know these things happen and you're going to have to deal with it, but how pivotal it was in the identity formation of these midwives. And finally, participation, the way in which they were able to participate in the work of the unit and actually feel as if they're developing the skills as part of the team. So ultimately, what did it mean to be a midwife? How did they come around to being a midwife? In my analysis of the stories, a lot of it was around accepting that things aren't going to be quite how they hoped they would be, and the those women-centered values, although they remained core to them, they recognized that there were organizational tasks that often took priority. So instead of spending 2 hours helping somebody with skin to skin, they were being pressurized to empty, get the room cleared and get the next person in. The band seven's got a lot of mention, in there. And again, I think it would be really interesting to find out more about, speaking to band sevens and their version of that story, because they're no doubt under huge pressure as well to keep the whole system moving along, keep it trucking along. So there was that sort of assimilation of values between the value of the value to the organization of keeping the process going, whilst also trying to fit in your own professional values that brought you into midwifery to begin with. Role models were important as well, again, about who you want to be, who you want to be like, and also who you don't want to be like. That came out as well. But ultimately, and 4 of the midwives I spoke to were still working as midwives when we completed the data collection. They were really happy to be working as midwives and staying with women. One of the midwives had left. She was still a midwife, but she was working in a charity. And interestingly, she said she felt more like a midwife there than she ever did in the NHS. I didn't explore that further because I was trying very hard not to ask more questions. But I know my supervisor said, "Oh, that's really interesting. You should have followed that up." I'd like to think, on reflection, that maybe it's because she had a bit more autonomy. She maybe didn't have as many people concerned with what she was doing and when she was doing it, but she felt very much like a different sort of midwife. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So that led me a bit onto communities of practice. Some of you, I'm sure, will have heard of communities of practice. Other people maybe not. It is a bit last century, but I'm a bit last century as well, so I'm not so worried about that. Communities of practice were sort of developed by Wenger and Larve, who talked about how people learn from each other in community. You can't create a community of practice. They emerge spontaneously from places where people are working together and learning together all the time. It's very much about learning as a social process, interactions with other people, learning what to do. And in midwifery, particularly thinking about how midwives share that tacit knowledge, that those things that are difficult to articulate, difficult to write down, difficult to research, but are so important to the process of being a midwife. And I then found the work of Fenton O'Creevy, who took that work a bit further and talked about landscapes of practice. And actually, this seemed to fit quite nicely with what the stories told me about the student experience, which was about how students actually, this work developed on from communities of practice because it was recognized students take different journeys and they have to move through these different communities. And they talked about how students could be a tourist, so they've got a low participation, but they're passing through, so they don't maybe necessarily feel that involved. Or a sojourner who, you see, my French accent is as bad as my German one, a temporary resident. So they maybe feel as if they need to learn more. They know they need to learn how to deliver a baby, but they still think that they're passing through because actually, and this came across in the stories, many of the people in my sample actually didn't necessarily want to work on the labour ward. They wanted to work in the community, but they knew that the labour ward was the key thing and they had to learn how to do that. So the landscapes of practice, I think, are interesting. And you'll see the word apprentice there as well. And as we're moving towards an increasing number of apprenticeship programs, that may be something that we want to reflect on and think about. I didn't in my thesis, because actually I think the apprenticeship model that we have now is slightly different to maybe what is the traditional apprentice, but it's something that's worth that might be worth thinking about and exploring further. And so I applied this to my data and my stories and this idea of you know, the tourist, the temporary resident and the newcomer, and how that can impact on identity. And really what I was trying to think about is what can we do to better engage students in the communities of practice as they're moving through, so that they feel that they can learn more, or indeed can they? Is it appropriate to do that? Is something that we could think about in a bit more detail. I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to pull it all together, as they say. So what did I learn? I learned that when newly qualified midwives talk about becoming midwife, they very rarely mention any of the skills or anything, any of the proficiencies or anything like that. What they talk about is the people, the position, so their social relationships. They talk about their values, why it was important to become a midwife. And in the process of that identity development, what was clearly key was a crisis or an ordeal of some sort, which really pushed them to think, am I now a midwife? Can I do this? And things to think about, to discuss, is, have we gone a bit too far in our focus on skills and attributes? I know when I was leading that work on employability, I used to talk to a lot of employers, not NHS employers, factories, businesses, IT companies, and they would say, what you're teaching the students now, by the time they've graduated, it's going to be out of date. You know, we can teach them what they need to know in 3 months. And that always sticks in my head, actually. I don't think you can learn to be a midwife in 3 months, by the way. But I just wonder if we've maybe got a bit too far down the line of these long lists. And then when the students qualify, we ask many preceptorship programs sort of recreate. And I think what that could do, again, you feel free to disagree with me, is actually undermines confidence and self-esteem, because the students say, oh, I've just done all of that, I've got to do it again. They don't think I can do it. And, you know, so I just feel, you know, I think there's a debate to be had there. NHS values-based retention rather than recruitment. So what can the NHS do? In all of its documents, the values are really clear and they do align really nicely with women-centred care. But the reality in the task orientation is that isn't always there. So is there more that could be done? Thinking about compliance or conformity and the way that midwives have to either comply, which is when they, you know, they go along with things, but their values don't really change, or whether they're going to just conform and adopt the values that they see. And how important it is to invest in relationships, particularly to improve outcomes. There is a lot of work now on non-technical skills and how those sort of same soft graduate attributes around communication and problem solving are as important as technical skills in healthcare environments to improve outcomes. So what can we do in the future, really? And so finally, to sum up, and I think I have been slightly more than 30 minutes, sorry, Sue. Professional and organisational identity is built from the learning which takes place within the social structures of practice. So that was my sort of final conclusion, that it's a very complex thing, but that identity is really important. There just isn't enough research, there aren't enough conversations. The conversations are all about what midwives can and can't do, and although that is really important, it's not the whole part of the story. So I'll be quiet now.
I don't think you can be very quiet, Suzanne. Thank you very much. That's so interesting. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I guess because when anyone asks you what what you do. You say, I am, your identity comes out, doesn't it? With knitted midwife or without. That's fantastic. And we do have, well, someone's asked two questions, and that's Celine. I'm sure there are more people there because I need to welcome folk from Canada and New Zealand. We've got
Oh,
this.
wow.
So hello to you. And you can ask some questions now because we've got 15 minutes of Suzanne and you can ask her anything. Celine, the first questions, I think this is a tricky question, but I bet Suzanne will answer it beautifully. Celine says, in a context of technological and medical culture, from your point of view, in the formation for midwives, how can we assess the being of being a midwife?
I mean, I think that is a really good question. And if I was to reflect on why we've got, for example, that those long list of proficiencies in the current NMC document,
Mm.
it's easier to assess what somebody does and to observe what they're doing. That is much easier to assess and to say, yes, they can do an abdominal palpation. Yes, they can refer somebody to a pediatrician if they're worried about a baby. And the assessment of professional values or who the person thinks is has always been harder. I know when I was a midwifery lecturer, it was unusual if people were failed on very specific skills. It was more likely to be those sorts of values based things. They're maybe just not as professional as we'd like them to be. They may be inconsistent in what they seem to be doing or behaving. And when you ask people to give, when I used to ask the mentors or the supervisors to give me, it's really difficult because it is really hard
Mm.
to assess that. And I don't know that we should be assessing it. I think maybe what we need to do is have a real think about what we do need to assess and just give everybody, the students, their supervisors, their managers, their assessors, a bit more time to be with each other and to learn. And I think maybe that's what I would answer to that, if that's an okay answer.
That's a good answer. Knowing there's only for a 3-year course, there's only 3 years. There's never enough time, is there? And any students will agree with that. And I know any midwives will agree with that, but it's a good point. Thank you. Celine, you started it and you're having a second question. And now, where did it go? How can we work in a community of practice when midwifery is recognised as often functioning as an oppressed group? Fear doesn't always come from the exterior.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And in fact, one of the criticisms around the theory of communities of practice is that they perpetuate poor culture because they're very much about fitting in and adapting to the practices and that are in that community. So that is one of the critiques of using that as an example of how we can help people to learn, because actually it's in an in a negative way, it's quite controlling because you have to fit in. And we know that when we look at the work that's been done right across the last 40 years, and I did do that, I went right back, in fact, it's longer than that, right back to the 1970s, looking at the research about why people left midwifery and nursing, because often they were midwives, much more often midwives and nurses then. It was the same reasons as people give now, which is that they couldn't give the care that they wanted to give. And it was that, they felt that they couldn't fit in, they couldn't comply with what was being asked of them. So they felt they had to leave. So I think that that's a good critique of communities of practice. If you really want to read about communities of practice, they do talk about how with effective leadership and and appropriate awareness of the structures that are in there, that change can take place. So it's not hopeless, but I think that's a really you're spot on with your criticism there. So thank you.
No, fabulous. I mean, I think I didn't. It's kind of as you were talking about, I've scribbled down people wanting to be anonymous and wanting to fit in, and that feels quite uncomfortable because
Mm-hmm.
you kind of think you need to be developing your identity. But I guess some of it is people are trying to develop that as they're fitting in and absorbing. But of course, if they're absorbing bad practice or bad attitudes, which is such a big thing
Mm-hmm.
within the maternity and within the NHS at the moment, isn't it? That's something I've also jotted down communication as a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, what you were saying about compliance, Cheryl, hi Cheryl. Cheryl says compliance or conformity was something I struggled with a lot when working in the NHS. I did not have the best experience as a student midwife, but I am grateful for the skills I now have as a midwife working overseas. Brilliant.
Yeah,
Fabulous.
that's great.
There are lots of comments, and I've got Kate Frith. Hi, Kate, who says, I find the midwifery identity narrative interesting. I was a general nurse first, and then I did 2 years midwifery training. Our cohort was always berated by our direct entry student midwives for not being truly with women for some reason. I'm also now an SCPHNH health visitor and have the same kind of discrimination. I feel I'm just a jack of all trades. You might be a master of all of them, of course, Kate, but I don't know, Suzanne.
No, I think yeah, and actually, what I didn't say in the answer, the earlier answer about communities of practice is and that idea of oppression. And I can get a bit political here now. So,
Okay.
but aren't we just awful to each other? You know, oh, you're a nurse, you're not a proper midwife. You're not a nurse, so you can't be a proper midwife because you can't look after the ill women. Or you're health. I mean, and that in a way is a representation of the social structures and the hierarchies where people feel the need to exert some sort of superiority or with their place in the hierarchy. Looking back at the data about whether it was nurses and for a lot, I was a nurse before I was a midwife. But I feel very much that I am a midwife. But I also have a nursing identity in my work at the NMC. I was asked to do some of the work there was around nursing, and I was still able to do that. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, but I also feel very passionately that we just need to value each other for what we can do and try not to get sucked into that narrative of who's better or worse. But I know we're all humans, and that's how we are. We're social beings. We want to be in one group, and you're in a different group, so I'm going to make sure you're not the same as me.
Know your place. Absolutely, that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, I've got Gillian White now, and Gillian says, my confidence and practice that shook off any baggage I had from being a student. I've seen the negative side of student working when they trained, finding it difficult to shake off that baggage. And I must comment, I'm looking over here because all your comments are coming on the other screen. Sorry, I'm not meaning to look away.
Okay, no, that's fine.
So that's about baggage. And then Kate Frith again, Kate. The best years I had in clinical practice were when I experienced high levels of collegiality. Oh,
Mm,
I love that. In a community midwifery group practice. Our director of midwifery was amazing too. I feel sad for the lack of continuity at the moment. I think absolutely.
mm, mm, mm.
I don't know, Suzanne, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think uh, one of the yeah, what I was going to say was that one of the participants in the study worked somewhere where everybody was put in the community as a newly qualified midwife.
Oh, wow.
Yes, now I know because at the time I was writing that, we were getting the recommendations from Ockenden that shouldn't
Yeah.
happen. but the story that that person had was very much of it building their confidence. And again, I'm not going to give you a quote, but I'm going to summarize. She talked about how it was a bit scary at first because she had nobody else to talk to. But then she very quickly learned to be self-reliant, all of those things, self-reliant. She was able to practice how she wanted to, and they were well supported to do that because they knew she was a newly qualified midwife. And a lot of in a lot of the stories, the midwives did talk about wanting to work in the community. There's sort of maybe the image that that's the place where you can most be the midwife that you want to be. But then also, really value that labour ward and that being with women during that time of birth is also very, very important. And in fact, all of them had ended up working in the labour ward, and that's where the staffing is directed now, isn't it? Is into hospital rather than the community. I don't know if that wasn't a question; it was a comment, wasn't it? I was just reflecting back on it.
Yeah, that's fine because that's very real. That is very real, isn't it? And it's interesting the way that other people look at maternity and midwifery and think this is what should be done, whereas us as midwives, we kind of know the pitfalls of all things. So if you go and sending newly qualified midwives in the community, you need to make sure they're in a team and they have got that support. And if they're going in the hospital, not getting stuck in the postnatal ward for 3 years, having some sort of learning experience as a newly qualified. So thank you. Oh, got one more from Jenny Hall. Hi, Jenny. And Jenny says, when I was a student back in the day, everything was task orientated. The lowest, the student would do a round of urine testing. Then we moved to students learning to have caseloads to care holistically for women in ward areas. Now it seems we've gone back to task-orientated care again. The MCAs do a lot of tasks and the students are having tick boxes. That's weird, isn't it? Don't know if you wanted to make any comments.
Well, no, I think it's just the sheer volume of I mean, just from a workload. This is my, I do feel quite passionately about that. And I know the EPAD or the EMORA, England or Scotland, it's a lot of it is online now. Even online, it's a fearsome document. In paper, it's this thick. And it takes such a lot of time. Yeah, all I've done for the last 30 years is think about educating midwives and nurses and other health professionals, writing courses, writing outcomes, assessing other institutions against them. And I just feel it's so complex and it takes up so much time. I really feel it's time now to have a serious conversation about what it is that we like. The very first question, what is it we actually need to assess and what can we give a bit more time to so that people can breathe, they can take time to build relationships and don't have to worry about, right, which page, where do you want me to sign now? I can't log on here, I'll have to do it at home. Midwives are busy enough without having to log on to PebblePad when they get home. So we need to move forward. We need to move into a digital age, but and I'm not saying we shouldn't have digital tools at all, but can we simplify would be my
that would be very nice. That would be very good. Okay, we've only got 2 more comments now because this is the hour that goes the fastest in the week. We have Cheryl G, working as a community midwife, was my lifeline when leaving the Corps. It allowed me to keep my midwifery passion alive. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Cheryl G. That's wonderful. And then Neka Nadefo. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Neka. My heart goes out to international students facing language and cultural challenges along work-based biases from other midwives. That's absolutely so as well. We haven't really discussed that aspect.
No. And I think I think that, it was a very homogenous sample and it would be really important. I think it would be really important to get stories from midwives from other backgrounds, other demographic groups, really important to add to those stories.
Yeah, because and I think I think your description of the narratives is lovely because midwife we do as midwives, we love stories because things come alive for us. So thank you so much for sharing the stories and your research, which has been fascinating. Now, I'm sure if I said anything to the audience, they'd all say, bring Suzanne back, and we're going to because she's got more to say and lots to say on lots of different aspects. So thank you so much, Suzanne. I'm going to say, I know this hour goes so quickly every week. I always say this, I always forget. I get to this point and think, crikey, where's it all gone? It has gone. So thanks to Suzanne. Also, thank you to Angelo, who's in the background, making sure this all nicely taped so that it will be available to you over the next few days and at 6 o'clock in the morning on Friday for those of you who like a podcast. And I know that's very popular with people. So that's going running smoothly. And thank you to Paul for sending all of these through, all these comments and questions through to me so quickly. Um, they're all going to be available. Okay. And next week, we're welcoming Lisa Allen and Maureen McDowell, who'll be talking about what matters and how women are helping shape maternity services for women who are neurodiverse. So this is very current. And remember also, I need to remind you that our Midwifery Festival is in London on the 11th of February, and there are still a few places. So if you want to come along, do come along. You can come face to face because we love that. We were talking about this actually before we came online. We love the online, doing this online thing, but it is lovely also meeting face to face and talking midwifery and being very midwifey. So that's fantastic. So thank you so much to everyone. First, Suzanne, and then to all of you who've attended this evening. And thank you to those who've made lovely comments and given some good questions to get the discussion going. Thank you so much. And we'll see you same time, same place next week. Take care.
We have had a 40% caesarean section rate in the National Maternity Hospital. That is major abdominal surgery.
Around 40,000 mums did not return to work in 2022. It's even more relevant if you're a mum who's experienced birth trauma.
We spend more money on litigation than we currently spend on the maternity services. It's bonkers.
That it's in all of our interests, and particularly the government, to improve maternity services.
We can't achieve our mission unless we bring parents and professionals together.
A revolution needs to happen. We need to start working together.
I know it's a hard time, but for goodness sake, it's the best profession in the world.
Be proud to be midwives, be proud of the job that we do, and continue to celebrate our successes.
Midwives make a difference to women every single day, and let's not lose that. It's more important than anything.